In June 1900, forces aligned with the Boxer movement surrounded the Chinese city of Tientsin, aiming to remove the region of foreign influence. Among those foreigners trapped inside the city was a young American engineer named Herbert Hoover. His eyewitness account is coming up next. The efforts of the family secured promise of some sort of scholarship at a Quaker college, Earlham College in Indiana. But my opposition was final when I found it had no engineering courses. About this time, a notice appeared in the press to the effect that public examinations would be held for entrance to the new free university founded by Senator Leland Stanford, shortly to be opened in California. Then came the announcement that mathematics professor Joseph Swain would conduct entrance examinations in Portland. Dr. Swain was a well-known Quaker, so that his association with the otherwise suspiciously godless institution served to overcome that family hurdle. Stanford is a coeducational institution, but I had little time to devote to coeds. However, a major event in my life came in my senior year. Miss Lou Henry entered Stanford and the geology laboratories, determined to pursue and teach that subject as a livelihood. As I was Dr. Branner's handy boy in the department, I felt it my duty to aid the young lady in her studies, both in the laboratory and in the field. And this call to duty was stimulated by her whimsical mind, her blue eyes, and a broad, grinnish smile that came from an Irish ancestor. I was not long in learning that she also was born in Iowa the same year as myself, and that she was the daughter of a hunting-fishing country banker at Monterey, who had no sons and therefore had raised his daughter in the out-of-door life of a boy. After I left college, she still had 3 years to complete her college work. I saw her once or twice during this period. We carried on a correspondence. In the summer of 1898, Mr. Moring was in Peking, China, in connection with some engineering work and financial contracts under a bond issue which had been placed in England, Belgium, France, and Germany to provide development capital for a concern called the Chinese Engineering and Mining Company. It was a large coal mining and cement manufacturing business operated by a European technical staff, but in majority Chinese-owned and under Chinese business management. The Chinese Director General, however, was selected by the government. The purpose of the new capital was to open further mines and to build an ice-free coal-loading port and connecting railway at Qinhuangtao on the Gulf of Chile. The Director General of this Chinese company, Mr. Chang Yen-mao, had recently been appointed head of the Bureau of Mines, a newly created department arising among the young Emperor Kwangshu's Reform and Progress movement. Chang consulted Moring as to the organization of the department, explaining that he was being buffeted by all the European governments seeking the appointment of their nationals to control the technical staff. Moring suggested that he avoid these political pressures by appointing an American as chief engineer. He further explained that he had in his employ such an American who could at the same time look after the bondholders' interest in the works to be undertaken by the Chinese Engineering and Mining Company. Upon Chang's authorization, Mr. Moring cabled to me at the Sons of Gwalior offering me the job, stating that the aggregate salaries would be about $20,000 per annum and expenses. What with a temperature of 100 degrees at midnight and the prospect of a new and romantic world, never was a message more enthusiastically received. Moreover, what was more important, I could now cable to Miss Lou Henry at Monterey, California, asking if she would agree that the time had come to be married and go to China. She thought that was possible. The uncertain and turbulent life of an engineer offered no obstacles to her. I arrived in London in January 1899 to pick up details. I reached California on February 10th. Miss Henry, having determined to join the Quaker faith, wanted a Quaker wedding. That particular kind of ceremony was not possible, as there was no Quaker meeting in that part of California, and the meeting is an essential part. There was at the moment no Protestant minister in the town, and we compromised on one of her old family friends, a Catholic priest. He secured a special dispensation, and we were able to catch the steamer the next morning for China. We sailed with a full batch of reading of all the standard books on Chinese life and customs. We arrived in Peking in March 1899. After long sessions with Chang Yen-mao and his multitude of advisors, Chinese and foreign, it was decided that we should live in Tientsin and that I should assemble the necessary engineering staff. We rented a house in the settlement, and Mrs. Hoover had the excitements of trying to furnish it from Chinese availabilities and equipping it with the necessary multitude of Chinese servants. As most of my journeys into the interior were under circumstances where reasonable comfort or privacy was impossible for any woman, she determined to fill her time learning to speak Chinese. For this, she engaged a Chinese teacher and never failed in her daily stint whenever she was at home. With a natural gift for languages, she made great progress in the most difficult tongue in the world. I never absorbed more than 100 words, but all our life afterwards, she kept that 100 words in use between us by speaking Chinese to me on sotto voce occasions. Despite the fact that when we went to work, it was 10 degrees below zero, we at once got the Chinese engineering and mining company's new harbor works started. The problem of building the new port at Qinhuangtao with its railway connections and of opening an additional coal mine with more modern equipment constituted something concrete that I could get a hold upon. But the Bureau of Mines, which was my major job, was something else. It was not only intangible and impalpable, but already, by palace intrigue, the Empress Dowager had wiped Emperor Kwangshu and his reforms away. Western ideas were no longer so popular. The young emperor had been dethroned and imprisoned. His tutor and advisor upon reform, Kang Yu-wei, had fled for his life. Chang Yen-mao was uncertain of the future, but thought that the Empress Dowager's regime could yet be brought to realize China's interest in the development of its natural resources. Chang was not wholly a pure or a reform spirit. He had been an agent of one of the Manchu princes and had ridden into profitable places in cooperation with the prince. He still hoped there was progress and power ahead. The reform period had bred a horde of foreign concession hunters demanding great mining areas with the aid of each foreign ambassador or minister, and, with large sums for too easy corruption, sometimes securing results. There was no form of mining law and no concept of development and production of minerals or the employment of people as a public interest. The whole process consisted in grabbing something that could be promoted upon the European stock exchanges. The constant encroachment by the European empires, Britain, Russia, Germany, France, on the independence and sovereignty of China had at last touched off hidden mines in the Chinese soul. There swept over North China one of those blind emotional movements not unusual among Asiatic masses. In the winter and spring of 1900, we began to hear of the new secret society directed against foreigners. It was named the Ai Ho Tuan, the mailed fist. The foreigners called it the Boxers. Their avowed purpose was to expel all foreigners from China, to root out every foreign thing, houses, railways, telegraphs, mines, and they included all Christian Chinese and all Chinese who had been associated with foreign things. They believed they had supernatural protection from foreign bullets and other great powers. How far they were originally encouraged by some of the officials around the Empress is not clear. Certainly the imperial group joined later. This, however, is not the place to recite the history of China in these times. It would take volumes, and I am here concerned only with the personal contacts of 2 young Americans with the forces in motion. By May 1st, 1900, the danger had grown so great that I called in our geological expeditions from the interior. These men had, however, outlined a field of anthracite coal greater than all the other anthracite fields in the world put together. In June, I went to Peking to see Chang, who was in mourning for his mother and by Chinese custom confined to his home, then in his country place outside of the city. I found him greatly agitated over the general outlook and especially the palace intrigues wherein the Dowager Empress was now encouraging the Boxer movement. In fact, the Boxers were then drilling in a neighboring village. Mrs. Hoover had accompanied me to Peking, and upon my return to the city next day, I found her very ill at the hotel. There was no doctor available, so I had her carried to the station and took the first train to Tientsin, where there was an able physician. That trouble proved to be a sinus stoppage and was quickly relieved. Rumors of Boxer attacks upon missionaries and others rumbled all about us. Foreign-drilled Chinese troops were brought up to protect the foreign settlement. On Sunday morning, June 10th, however, we were rudely awakened by shells bursting over the settlement from modern artillery, the foreign-drilled army. At first we thought it was poor firing from gunners trying to reach groups of Boxers on the other side of the settlement. Soon, however, such foreign officers who were drilling the Chinese army as could escape came running into the settlement. They reported that the troops had killed several of their European comrades. The alarm bell on the town hall was rung, and we expected the worst. Tientsin had no consequential defense works, but there were about 1,100 sailors and marines of various nationalities in the settlement who, during the few days previous, had been sent up from war vessels in the port at Taku, 60 miles away. They were on their way to Peking to protect the foreign legations. They had no artillery except 2 small cannon and only a dozen machine guns. It was a small force to oppose some 25,000 foreign-equipped Chinese troops. Had those troops attacked that day, they could easily have overwhelmed the settlement. We learned later that, though urged by the Boxers, they had no stomach for attack and that there were great disputes as to a command because of the absence of the foreign officers. Quickly, the settlement pulled itself together. A Russian, Colonel Wogak, outranked the other foreign officers. All the troops, American, Japanese, German, Russian, French, and Italian, accepted Wogak's command, except the British, under command of a naval bully named Captain Bailey, who was his own law. Learning of my engineering staff, Wogak sent word to us to organize the Christian Chinese, who had fled to the settlement for safety, to build barricades. The settlement was about a quarter-mile wide and a mile long, protected by the river on one side. In hunting material for barricades, we lit upon the great godowns, or warehouses, filled with sacked sugar, peanuts, rice, and other grain. Soon we and other foreigners whom I enlisted had 1,000 terrified Christian Chinese carrying and piling up walls of sacked grain and sugar along the exposed sides of the town and at cross streets. By morning, we were in a better state. The big attack came the second day, but the Marines and sailors repulsed it from behind our bags. Our house was on the edge of the settlement and exposed to constant rifle and artillery fire. We, with other American families, joined up with Edward Drew, the Commissioner of Customs, who lived near the center of the settlement and was, we thought, better protected, since his house was partially surrounded by godowns. Later it turned out not to be so good because of the effort of bad artillerymen to set the godowns on fire. Practically all the Chinese servants had run away, but fortunately 2 of ours remained loyal and constituted the whole kitchen staff at the Drews. On the first day, one of my staff, Wilfred Newbury, climbed on the roof of our house to look about. He spied the settlement's dairy herd pasturing peacefully about a mile out. Mounting a pony, he calmly drove the herd into our yard. although exposed to fire every foot of the way. That herd became invaluable later on for hospital meat and milk. The acute dangers came from two sources. The first, the possibility of mass attack. The second, the incessant and furious artillery fire. Some 60,000 shells were fired into the settlement from first to last. The first attacks proved to be sporadic, though sometimes there were concentrated attacks directed mostly against the spot where the settlement joined up with the Chinese city of Tientsin. Here, Boxers and Chinese troops could approach under cover of the houses. If, while engaging in these attacks, they had simultaneously brought pressure upon the other sides, we could not have held out, for at times we did not have a man every 100 yards on those barricades. We soon found the best protection against rifle bullets and shells was to keep in the lee of walls when moving about or trying to snatch a moment of sleep. I soon had an additional anxiety. The Boxer movement, as I have said, was directed against Chinese who had relations with foreigners as much as against foreigners themselves. The day of the first attack, Chang Yenmao and Tong Xiaoyi, the director of railways previously referred to, came into the settlement with their families. They found quarters in a compound across the street from our house belonging to the Chinese Engineering and Mining Company. Here they were quickly joined by 500 or 600 other minor Chinese officials and foreign-educated Chinese in similar plight. Their first need was food and water. With the help of some of the Chinese men, I transported each morning a supply of water and rice and such other food as we could get from the godowns to their compound. In the main, however, my staff and I were preoccupied with strengthening the barricades and boiling water in the boilers of the municipal water plant for distribution to the soldiers and civilians. The waterworks was outside of the barricades, and with an outpost, we operated it at night and in the morning brought the boiled water back in the municipal street sprinkling carts. The British Tommies, who formed our nightly guard, being aware of the corpses floating in the nearby canal, painted large signs on the sides of the water carts, Boxeril, being reminiscent of a British beef extract, Bovril. An increasing number of foreigners, soldiers and civilians, were wounded. We had only one army doctor and our settlement physician. Similarly, there was only one professional nurse. Colonel Wogak turned the settlement club into a hospital, and soon all the floors were covered with wounded. Mrs. Hoover volunteered at once, and I saw little of her during the first period of the siege, except when she came home occasionally to eat or catch a little sleep. She became expert in riding her bicycle close to the walls of buildings to avoid stray bullets and shells, although one day she had a tire punctured by a bullet. She found some Christian Chinese women who could milk the cows, and with the aid of Newbury and an English boy named Simpson, organized the dairy herd for service. At a later stage, she had great need in the hospital for soup meat. She directed young Simpson to kill one of the less productive cows. He was not an experienced butcher. He succeeded merely in grievously wounding the cow with an army revolver. When finally he got her down, he tired of trying to skin her and simply chopped her up with an axe, hide and all. The stray bullets fired from a long distance outside came near developing a major tragedy. A number of foreign civilians already in near hysteria mood concluded they were being fired from within the settlement. They quickly picked upon the 600 Chinese of whom I had charge in the compound across the street. The first I knew of it was when a messenger came in while we were at supper after a totally exhausting day to say that Chang Yenmao, Tong Xiaoyi, and others had been arrested and were being given a drumhead trial by Captain Bailey. I rushed to the place to find a so-called trial going on under torchlights with Bailey a pompous judge and various hysterical wharf rats testifying to things that could never have taken place. I attempted to intervene and explain who these Chinese were, but Bailey ordered me to get out. I was told that some Chinese had already been executed on the nearby riverbank. I made for the Russian headquarters a few blocks away on my bicycle, and Colonel Wogak, quickly appreciating the situation, returned with me, accompanied by a Russian platoon. He stopped the trial instantly, and the Chinese were turned over to me for return to their compound. Somewhat later in the siege, Mrs. Hoover and I and our engineering staff returned to our own house for a base, as it had not been hit. Late one evening, however, a shell banged through a back window and then, exploding, blew out the front door and surroundings. Mrs. Hoover, after a long day at the hospital, was sitting in a side room playing solitaire. She never stopped the game. A few evenings later, several shells came close, and finally one exploded in the compound across the street where the Chinese were living. Agnew and I rushed over and found that it had landed in Tong Xiaoyi's place, killing his wife and baby and slightly injuring one of his children. Tong was naturally distracted, but helped us to gather up the other children. Agnew, Tong and I, each carrying one and leading others, brought them across to our house, where Mrs. Hoover took charge of them, and Tong recovered his calm. I relate this incident because of its denouement. Some 18 years afterward, when I was War Food Administrator in Washington, Mrs. Hoover and I received an invitation to dine at the Chinese legation. While I was taking the minister's wife out to the dining room, Mrs. Koo said in perfect English, "I have met you before. I am Tong Xiaoyi's daughter, whom you carried across the street during the siege of Tientsin." Mrs. Koo was a most attractive woman. Unfortunately, she died a few years later. 28 years later, when I was in Shanghai, I received gracious hospitalities from her sister. The siege lasted about a month. It was not altogether a fight between soldiers. It was a group of civilian men, women, and children fighting for very life against a horde of fanatics with modern arms, and they were fighting with their eyes open to a form of death that everyone knew, but did not mention. Truly, we were fighting under the courageous protection of a few hundred soldiers of a half-dozen nationalities, without whom we would have been lost. But we were fighting without artillery, except the 2 small cannon, against tens of thousands with modern arms, with only 2 things in our favor: inside lines and more intelligence. Most of us made it a business not to think or discuss the possibilities. We did have one dreadful person who periodically wanted to know if I intended to shoot my wife first if they closed in on us. Most of the people lifted such lumps from their minds with whatever gleam of humor was possible. In the midst of all this, we did have one intermediate day of exaltation. A Chinese messenger got through in the night of about the 15th day with word that relief armies were on their way from Taku and would be in the next day. We were warned not to fire on them by mistake. During the morning, the Chinese stopped firing on us. Soon someone said he heard cannonading in the distance. How we strained our ears. Then it came plainer and plainer. We climbed on the roof of the highest warehouse to get a glimpse. We saw them coming over the plain. They were American Marines and Welsh Fusiliers. I do not remember a more satisfying musical performance than the bugles of the American Marines entering the settlement, playing "There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight." They proved to be only a few hundred soldiers added to our force, but they had machine guns and some artillery, and we felt better for a while. Then the Chinese closed the ring again, and with even more violent and more dangerous assaults. Late in July, sufficient forces came in to drive the Chinese back far enough for calm, if not peace. Most of the wounded, the women and children, were evacuated under guard, down the river, as well as many civilian men. Mrs. Hoover and 6 or 7 other women refused to desert their posts, as there were some wounded who could not be moved. When sufficient forces arrived, it was determined to attack the Chinese army itself. As I was familiar with topographic details from horseback riding about the settlement with Mrs. Hoover, I was requested by Colonel Waller, in command of the American Marines, to accompany them as a sort of guide in their part of the attack on the Chinese city. We came under sharp fire from the Chinese located on its old walls. We were out in the open plains with little cover except Chinese graves. I was completely scared, especially when some of the Marines next to me were hit. I was unarmed, and I could scarcely make my feet move forward. I asked the officer I was accompanying if I could have a rifle. He produced one from a wounded Marine, and at once I experienced a curious psychological change, for I was no longer scared, although I never fired a shot. I can recommend that men carry weapons when they go into battle. It is a great comfort. With the final relief forces came a number of American newspaper correspondents. Mrs. Hoover opened our house to all of them who would forage for food. She provided floor spots to sleep upon for 12 or 15, including Joaquin Miller, the California poet, who was representing the Hearst Press. This picturesque old gentleman finally hired a rickshaw to take him to Peking. We told him that the foreigners there were still under siege and that there were a few armies in between. But such arguments seemed to carry little weight with Joaquin. Mrs. Hoover finally bribed his rickshaw boy to desert him, and he remained contentedly with us. The foreigners in Peking had suffered a longer siege and were without the advantage of food warehouses, but there were no modern troops against them and no modern artillery. Their losses were small. At this time, the South African War was raging, and the dramatic and much news-commented sieges of Kimberley, Mafeking, and Ladysmith had just been relieved. The total losses of defenders in all three of these put together did not equal our white losses at Tientsin, to say nothing of the losses among the Chinese refugees. But their publicity arrangements were better. Peking being relieved, the Empress Dowager and her government fled into the interior. It seemed to me that I had been delivered a strong hint, by way of artillery fire, that my engineering engagement with that government was over.